Islam, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that the difference between people when it comes to, you know, the virtues, if you will, of spiritual seclusion are similar to the difference of people when it comes to the virtues of being married or staying single. Typically, when we think of marriage in Islam, it's a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. It's a sunnah of living as a human being to perpetuate the human race. But believe it or not, in our tradition, our stance on marriage is based on an individual's circumstances. So marriage can be an obligation, it can be a recommendation, it can be merely a permissible act to do, it could be something disliked. It could basically run the gamut of all of the legal rulings in our legislation. And that's based on each individual. Some people, they have to get married. They just absolutely must in order to preserve their chastity. They have to get married. Some people, it's recommended that they get married. They may not be in dire need, but it certainly may help them or her, help him or her in order to, preserve themselves and keep away from sin, etc. And then there may be people that, look, it's just something mubah. It's just like, do it or don't do it. It's up to you. And then there's, obviously, it could be to downgrade from there if a person is just not capable, not able, not financially fit, physically fit, maybe, in order to handle the responsibilities of a spouse, the rights of the other spouse. So they may not be interested. And so it may become oppressive. And so, that has to be considered. And so uzla, or spiritual seclusion, is the same way. A person has to take into consideration who they are and what their needs are and their capabilities. If a person is unable to seclude themselves and benefit spiritually, then look, don't do it. But you do need to know the benefits. You do need to know the manners and how to go about it in order to make that decision. So we're going to start with some of these benefits here, and we'll look at some of the downfalls as well in a later session. So the first benefit that the Imam mentions here, he says that when you're secluded from community life and socializing, you have time for worship. Often I hear in my line of work, in faith-based organizations, in mosques, etc., I hear from congregants and community members, look, I'm just so busy. My work life is hectic. My family life requires a lot of time. And then I am weary and I'm worn out, and so I don't have the energy to do what I would really like to do in terms of my spiritual endeavor, my religious pursuits, prayers, reading Quran, making dhikr, fasting, etc. So now, in this time, if we would consider it downtime for many of us, even though many of us are still working from home, and we do still have family responsibilities, we are not hanging out, we're not pursuing our hobbies and our passions outside a lot of times, and so we're freed up. And so now is the opportunity to take advantage of that free time. The free time in order to create or to rekindle an intimate conversation with Allah, the glorified and majestic. In order to do that, in order to create this very robust, intimate, if you will, conversation and connection with Allah, it requires time. A person can't expect that they're going to develop such a robust relationship with Allah by giving it 5 minutes a day. It's like another relationship. The deep relationships, they require time and energy. They require a great deal of effort. And the same thing can be said about your relationship and your connection to Allah. And so now, if you take advantage of this free time that you have, it will pay off when it comes to, the connection that you have with your Lord, the majestic. And of course, you don't have this free time when you're mixing and mingling and socializing in your community life. So the uzla, or this seclusion, it can be an avenue to that. And this is especially right in the beginning, when you are fresh and you are excited about worship and the opportunity. You have not become weary by long sessions of worship, etc. And that's a real thing. that is a thing that you can overdo it in terms of your worship. And that's why you find in our legislation, there's a variety of different things that a person can do that are acts of worship. There's a variety of things. There's reading the Quran, there's making dua, there's praying. Even in the prayers, there's some, there's some different types of praying that a person can do. Even in the obligatory prayers, is rakatay al-fajr, there's 2 units in fajr and 4 in dhuhr and 4 in asr and 3, etc. So you find some, I guess, different things to mix it up so that it does not become monotonous and you become tired, if you will, and weary very quickly. So especially right at the beginning, the energy level is high, the excitement hopefully is there, and you can dive right into that. Some of the wise, if you will, the wise men of the past, they would talk about, asceticism or the ascetics and being alone and isolated. And they would basically say, what does that lead to? What is the thing in which the, isolation, khulwa, it leads to with the ascetic, basically their spiritual seclusion? And they said it leads to intimacy with Allah. It leads to intimacy with Allah. And one of the early generations, this is from the Tabi'een, his name was Uwais ibn Amir al-Qarni, rahimahullah ta'ala. He was from the early Tabi'een. He actually lived during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but he did not meet him, so he was not considered a companion. And he said, ما كنت أرى أن أحدا يعرف ربه فيأنس بغيره, that I've never seen anyone or witnessed someone that came to know or became acquainted with their Lord being intimate with someone else. Right? So almost as if that relationship that you can develop, the opportunity to develop such a relationship based on awareness and deep gnosis, spiritual awareness of Allah, it can be a very robust relationship to the point that, look, that's it, man. That's all I really need. That desire that we have as human beings to connect with someone else, if you're able to, really nurture the relationship that you can have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will satisfy that desire that we have to connect. And so right now, while we're unable to connect as we're used to with other people, and we are feeling the pinch of that, many of us that are very social and we're used to being out and connecting and conversing and sharing with others, we can find a real richness in the relationship that we can establish with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we can take the time now that we have to invest in that, and it will satisfy us. And the more that you invest in it, you'll find the greater satisfaction that you'll have, to the point that even the relationships that you've had with other people, they cannot quite be as satisfying as a relationship that you can have with Allah. He also says that the more intimate that you become, I guess, if you will, or the deeper the relationship that you have, the easier it is for you to be constantly in a state of remembrance. And the same thing goes for thoughtfulness and reflection. This is how a person is able to grasp or to obtain, to actualize this type of gnosis or awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, this spiritual seclusion is how you're able to free yourself up for that which is better than anything that you could possibly imagine when it comes to fellowship. If you're able to achieve that, a state of continuous remembrance of Allah, a state of continual pondering and reflection in order to get to know Allah better, then freeing yourself up from that community life will certainly be better than any benefit you could have gotten from it. More than likely, right? And so, this and that, of course, not all of us are going to do this for an extended period of time. And as was mentioned earlier, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he said that everyone should take a portion of uzla. They should basically schedule some time for this spiritual seclusion. So here we are. That is the first benefit. The first benefit being having the free time to embark upon religious pursuits, worship, connection with the divine. The next benefit that we're going to look at, and this will be pretty lengthy because it basically contains a number of things. So while you're free to pursue religious activity, prayer, etc., number 2 is you're also freed from sin. Hopefully, right? You are safe from falling into sins that you are typically vulnerable from, or vulnerable from these types of sins for the most part when you are mixing and mingling with other people. When you're alone, when you're spiritually secluded, practicing uzla, you're going to find yourself less inclined to the typical sins that you would make while you're with other people. What type of sins could those be when you're mixing with other people? So the Imam, he mentions 4 things. The first of those is al-ghiba, which is backbiting. And we know the deadly nature of al-ghiba. And you know, ghiba is when you mention a quality about someone that they do not like you to mention in their absence. That's ghiba, even if it's true. And you're mentioning these qualities, physical qualities, spiritual qualities, habits, tics, whatever, professional. It could be anything. If they don't like that you're mentioning that about them and they're not there, that's called ghiba. And this is a major sin. And this is a very typical sin that is committed by many people. It's such an easy thing to fall into. And the Imam mentions here that people make a habit of tamadmad bil a'rad, with people's honor. You know, tamadmad is in wudu when you put water in your mouth and you swish it around. And he's saying that the habit most people have is that they make this tamadmad, right? They're swishing around people's honor in their mouth by backbiting them. And so this happens when you're with other people. You know, you get to talking, you get to chit-chatting, the initial niceties and productive conversation that you could be having quickly comes to an end when you wrap it up. And then while you're sitting there trying to be social, often the conversation begins to degrade into speaking about other people. And before you know it, you've spent a great deal of time, running someone through the mud, if you will. And so, of course, you're there and you are committing a sin while you are socializing. And of course, you're basically opening yourself up to the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're becoming vulnerable to that. And even if you're there and you're quiet and you're not saying anything, you're like, look, I'm not going to backbite. I'm not going to say anything bad. But if the other person is, you're a party to that. You're a part of that, a partner in that, just by simply listening, especially if you do not say anything to put an end to it. Listening to the person while they're backbiting, you are the second part of that. That's what completes the circle of backbiting. One person to say it. If they're saying it by themselves, then it's not like backbiting, but it takes the second party, the listener, in order to complete that circle so that it is backbiting. And, if you do say something, and think about this, maybe you did this before when you were a witness to backbiting, you said, hey, look, I'm uncomfortable with this type of conversation. I don't think we should be talking about this person or that person. Let's try and keep it positive. Typically what happens, now, not all the time, but you'll get this adverse reaction to that. Like, what's the big deal? I mean, take it easy. Or I'm not saying anything. I'm not lying. Am I lying? Or why are you making this such a big deal? You may be exposed to somebody's anger. People get upset with you for saying that or trying to put an end to the conversation. And then when you leave, what could happen? More than likely, if you do decide to stand up like, look, I'm not going to be able to sit here any longer. I'm going to have to excuse myself because I won't be able to stop it. Then when you leave and walk out, what would they probably do to you? They would probably start backbiting you as well. And so that would just contribute to continual backbiting. Uzla, spiritual seclusion, you're not there. You've removed yourself from that social setting, and so you're safe. You're safe from ghiba. Number 2 of the sins that typically happen, and this has a lot to do with the first, the example of being present while someone is backbiting another, you have an obligation to enjoin the good and forbid the evil. Al-amru bil-ma'ruf wa nahy al-munkar. So when you are among people, this is an obligation. It is a communal obligation. And it may be an individual obligation upon you based on the setting that you're in. And so you're having to witness these evils and these sins. And if you are quiet and silent and you let it go, guess what? That's sinful. It's sinful for not speaking out and trying to put an end to evil. And of course, there are details to that. And we covered that in a previous lesson. Some of the details to, enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. And of course, if you do enjoin the good and forbid the evil, when you are witnessing sin, so you are trying to put an end to that, then you are also become vulnerable to different types of harms and hardships. It can be a very, very difficult spot to be in when you're trying to, encourage people to do the right thing, as was the example in backbiting. They get upset, they may react in a negative way, they may begin to call you names or to put you down or to backbite you or whatever it may be. And when you have secluded yourself for spiritual reasons, uzla here is what we're talking about. If you've secluded yourself, then, well, there's no obligation upon you because you're not witnessing the munkar. You're not seeing other people sin. And so you don't have to be exposed to those types of things. The next thing, number 3, the third sin here that is typically, we are typically vulnerable to, and that is riyat. Riyat, as many of you are familiar with, is a type of hypocrisy. It is, it begins with hypocrisy or a type of hypocrisy. This is a chronic disease, ar-riyat. It's like showing off and being insincere, not being genuine, especially when it comes to Allah. And so this riyat begins with hypocrisy or being two-faced. That's a big deal in Islam, to be two-faced. And so it's very difficult to safeguard yourself from riyat. And this begins when you're mixing with people and you have to sometimes put on a face, if you will, that you're actually that you actually want to see someone or you are actually missing someone. Sometimes we say things like, I can't live without you. We say things like, I can't live without you. I can't go on without you. I'm just missing you so much, sometimes we embellish our desire to be with someone. And I'm not just talking about with spouses, but also people, other people. Oh, it's so great to see you. I haven't seen you in so long. Think about how many times you felt that you needed to put on the show, in order to make, that is a wedge hain. That's the wedge hain. It's like a two-faced person where, in fact, inside you're just kind of like, look, oh my God, do I have to talk to this person? Oh my God, I can't. Really, I haven't seen you in years because it's intentional. I haven't wanted to see you in years because we don't get on. And so now you're having to put on this double face with a person. So this is where it begins. Now you're doing something that's not genuine. You're doing something that's not genuine. And, people may say, look, you need to consider other people's feelings, etc., etc. But sometimes there are moments where this is done out of innocence. And there are certain circumstances in Islam where it's permitted to say these types of things, with your spouse, like, oh, you look so great, or the food was delicious, when in fact it's the opposite. Those types of little things may be okay and encouraged at times. But as a general practice, having this two-facedness is a bad quality. This is a type of hypocrisy, and this develops the characteristics of riyat and nifaq, of hypocrisy and of being insincere. It also is not void of lying. Typically, you have to lie, even if they're small little white lies. I mean, the examples that I just gave, you end up having to lie. And so either this is like the root of it, in which your heart is just absolutely void of any of these feelings that you have, or it's, you have to embellish. The feeling may be there, like, I like this person, but then I embellish it with such, I just throw on the praise and put on the words. And that's another part of this riyat, is sometimes we encourage this. We can encourage each other, and we can pump each other up beyond what is actually spiritually healthy. As servants of Allah, as worshipers, and we should be humble. That should be the quality that we try to help each other develop, being humble, and not really just really putting on the big one for everybody. You're this, you're amazing, you're that, you're just filling their head with hot air. It does not do well for the soul. It bloats the ego with these empty words. And so the pious of the past, they used to get worried about this type of a thing. And they talk about when someone would ask them how they're doing. How are you this morning? How are you this evening? And it used to be that the pious of the past would ask this question because they were concerned about the person's. They were asking, how are you doing this morning spiritually? Typically today we're asking, like, how are you feeling? How are you doing with work, with those types of things? But previously they were asking, how are you doing spiritually? How are you doing with your faith? And that question would draw out of them this feeling that they needed to unload all of the good things. Great, my iman is so high, I'm living in the blessings of Allah, etc., etc. I've become so aware of the divine, I've been given this spiritual insight on all these types of different things. And that, at some point, started to become what it is today, to where we're asking mostly about how are you doing, how are you feeling, how is the family, how are the kids, how is work, how is life, how is finance, how is whatever the thing may be, very worldly types of questions. And so the pious of the past, they would become a little bit worried about this. In fact, they would say, look, in our tradition, we say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. That's what we do when we greet each other. We don't need to kind of serve up this ball for you to hit a home run with every time we engage with each other. And so some of them would begin to say, Asbahna du'afa mudnibin. We are weak and sinful. Na'kulu arzaqana. We are consuming our provisions. Wa nantadhiru ajalana. And we're just waiting for our time to be over. Kind of like, let's just end all of this, the extraness that sometimes that we have with each other. It's all fake, a lot of that stuff can be very fake. And while this may not be that big of a deal to many people, it may not seem like that big of a deal, the earlier generations were very different than we are when it came to the spirituality. I will mention something that is very relevant for today, that we can apply this principle to. This riyat, social engagement, and being two-faced or being insincere. Social media. We see this in social media all the time. Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, here. All of these social media outlets and channels and apps and things, we struggle with that. To be sincere, to be real. A lot of it is someone posing for a picture or a scripted video so that they can show people a life that they're not actually living. A moment of happiness and blessing and just overwhelmed with joy that is not actually the reality of their lives. And what ends up happening, many of us think like, well, my life is terrible. Look at the way they live their life. But that's fake. It's riyat. This is a type of nifaq. It's being insincere. This is having two faces. So back to this, so that gives you some modern day context about this issue. Back to this thing here with the Imam saying about how are you this morning, how are you this evening. It was once, this is a story about al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, one of the great pious Imams of the past. He was sitting alone in Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. And he was there by himself. And someone came up to him and said, "Ya Abu Ali." His name was Abu Ali, his kunya. And he says, "How are you?" And so al-Fudayl said, "Look, what brought you here? Why'd you come? What are you seeking me out for?" And he's like, "Look, I just wanted to check on you, and it's out of love and stuff." And he's like, "Nah, I don't really buy that. I mean, what did you come here for except that, you can put on a show for me and then I can put on a show for you and you can lie a little to me and then I can lie a little to you." He's like, "Look, let's just skip all that. Let's skip all that. We don't need to do all that. Just you go he basically said, "Look, either you're going to get up and go or I'm going to get up and go, but we're not going to go through this. We're not going to go through this." And so guess what? When you are secluded spiritually, you can save yourself from that type of interaction, which is not always sincere. It's not always sincere as it should be. Basically, the Imam says that if these types of inquiries are not done out of compassion for the person and out of love, then they're done out of hypocrisy, that they're done out of, insincerity. They're done perhaps like, having out of an obligation, if you will, in which you feel that you have to do more than what comes natural. It's basically what it is. Even it could be hatred in someone's heart or jealousy, that they want to hear something bad. They're looking for something, or they're looking for a way to, spoil the situation. So when you are spiritually secluded, like we could potentially be right now while we are socially isolated, then it can be an opportunity to avoid this type of sin and this pitfall. He also goes on and he says, look, if you don't meet people when you interact with them on the same wavelength of manner and interaction, they're going to be upset with you. They're going to detest you. They're going to belittle you and backbite you. And that will be at the expense of their own faith. I mean, imagine that if someone said, like a Fudayl ibn Iyad said, look, just why are you here? Just either I'm going to get up or you're going to get up, but I'm not going to go through this little social interaction that we feel like we have to do and put on the show with the Instagram photos and the Snapchat photos that aren't real. I'm not going to do all of that. And the person will be like, oh my God, look at this person. So extreme, so over the top, so overboard, so holier than thou. They're going to lose their deen because of that situation. Basically, they're falling into sin. And that is basically number 3. Number 4, and this is where we will conclude for the evening. Number 4 from the sins that a person can avoid with the spiritual seclusion is picking up bad behavior. Picking up bad behavior from other people. When you are around people, there is a tendency to pick up on their habits. And there's a tendency to pick up on the bad habits. And this is very, very difficult to spot. It happens so slowly and so slightly at times that only a really insightful person would recognize the change. The more you're around a person, the more they wear off on you. And you could spend a couple of months, years, and you would no longer be recognizable as who you were before that. So it's very difficult if you're picking up the bad habits. So if you sit with somebody who's an open sinner and you're around them all the time, then you're having to witness their evil. And what happens is you become accustomed to that evil, especially if it's major sins. And you begin to measure yourself. You measure yourself by what they do. And so if you're a rather religious person or you're striving to be a pious person, when you're around somebody of that low caliber, then your measure of piety becomes very different. Your standards of piety can become very skewed. So what happens is you start to see people committing major sins, And then you begin to belittle the minor sins that you commit. You say, well, at least I'm not doing that. I'm not committing those major sins that they are. My sins are just minor. I mean, these are no big deal. Whereas before, you would have been a little bit more concerned and maybe disappointed in yourself and working to fix yourself with those minor sins. A person can be destroyed by minor sins, as was indicated by the Prophet ﷺ. And when you look at, and the opposite is also true. You know, when you look at the lives of the early generations and the pious, and then you compare yourself to that, then you start going, man, who am I? I'm nobody. I don't have room to have an ego and to be bloated, my ego to be bloated and to think highly of myself. When I look at their level of piety and religiosity, and I look at myself who I think I'm striving and I'm making some real headway, I'm actually, you know, there's still like miles to go. So when you're around people that are constantly living in sin, and you've taken them as, you know, a social circle, or you're just exposed to them at the workplace, or guess what, on TV. That's another important thing to note during this time of isolation. If you're wanting to make this social distancing moment in our lives, spiritual seclusion, you might not be around those people in person, but if you're turning the TV on and you're watching evil and sin, and you know, you're going to have a skewed view of what all that is and what it means to you. You're going to start going, well, look, I mean, we're here in this environment, so it's not that big of a deal. I mean, really, you can't make a big deal out of all these things all the time. You see, you've been worn down by this type of company and this type of social engagement. And that's from the benefits of seclusion, is that you can preserve the measure of piety that, you know, has been set in our faith, as opposed to letting it get worn down. And every once in a while you need to do that. Every once in a while you need to step aside in order to, you know, recalibrate your spiritual compass, if you will. He gives a great example of this, and he says, think about things that happen often and you're witnessing them and how that impacts you. Person say, oh, I'm not impacted. That you're fooling yourself. I'm not changing. I haven't been affected by them. You're fooling yourself if you think that you haven't been changed. Things happen when they're repetitive. Look at the example he gives. He says, when you see a Muslim during Ramadan that eats in public, what do you do? How do you react? Muslim, and they're not excused. It's not like they're traveling or sick or something like that. But they're just out there. They're like, look, I'm just eating. How do we react? We react, we're like, our jaws drop. I mean, we're like, oh my God, can you see this person there eating in the daylight of Ramadan? And gets to the point that we start going, are they even Muslim? But then at the same time, we could see people that delay the prayer, and we don't think much of it, meaning delay it beyond its time, not within its window of time, but delay it beyond its time, meaning they habitually make prayer late. And we go, oh, not a big deal. I mean, it's normal because we pray 5 times a day, and the person that has made that a habit, it happens all the time. So we witness that happening around us, and it's like, this is the norm. They're not praying on time, oh well. But if you see the person not fasting the day of Ramadan one day on purpose, it's like they're not Muslim. The prayer is, if you leave it one time, it could jeopardize your Islam, not intentionally breaking your fast because you're hungry and you don't want to fast that day. So that's a powerful example that shows exactly how that works. He also mentions when you see a religious person, a scholarly type, or a judge who's wearing a gold necklace or a silk robe, a silk shirt. We know that for men, you can't wear gold jewelry. You can't wear a silk. You see them and you're going, look what they're wearing. You make this big deal out of it. But then you hear them backbiting and it doesn't register because backbiting is so normal and so commonplace. It's a major sin, not like wearing gold necklaces or rings or something for men or silk. They're very different in the you know, the level of the sin. But we get accustomed to seeing people backbite, and so it doesn't register like it should anymore. We become desensitized. We become indifferent to these types of sins when we are around them and overexposed to them. And so basically, while you are in seclusion, if it's a spiritual seclusion, then you can save yourself from that indifference. You can begin to rebuild, if you will, your spiritual awareness and understanding of the nature of these things and recalibrate. And that's what I think we need to do during these days. Take some time to recalibrate our spiritual compass, to get back to our religious center of what is balance. You know, what are the things that we should be doing to gain Allah's pleasure and His love and His mercy? And what are the things that we should be staying away from that would gain His anger and His wrath? I mean, I can't imagine a better time to do that than right now, while we are facing a trial and an affliction for many people. This is the time. If you can't take this for what it is, as an alarm and an alert, then when will we ever hear the alarm and the alert? The time is now. And so these are just some of the benefits that we can take if we are sincere and we make the best of the situation. As much as many of us don't want to be doing this, and we're worried about a lot of other things, and you have the right to be worried about health, you have the right to be worried about finances, but you need to take the opportunity that you're given. Walk away with something. You don't want to lose everything during this time.